America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
Donald Trump said he wants to serve a third term as president. The U.S. Constitution states no person shall be elected more than twice. Some Trump supporters suggest there could be ways around that. A Trump bid for a third term would no doubt set off legal battles in states across the nation. There are no credible legal arguments for a third term. That's what Jeremy Paul, a constitutional law professor at Boston's Northeastern University, told CBS News. But that may not be stopping the president or others from saying there is a way. Welcome to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton, and joining me is Praveen Fernandes, Vice President at the Constitutional Accountability Center and a constitutional law expert. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So in an exclusive interview with NBC News, the president did not rule out the possibility of seeking a third term in the White House, and he said there were methods for doing so and clarified that he was, quote, not joking. And he added, a lot of people want me to do it. Let's cut right to the chase before we get into the finer points of the Constitution and some of the arguments on the table. Trump's assertion, there are methods for doing so. Are there?
No, none that I'm aware of. And I think, you've neatly summarized the 22nd Amendment, but just to make it even more clear, the 22nd Amendment does two things. It prohibits any person from being elected president more than twice, but it also does something else. It prohibits a person who served more than 2 years of another person's term from being elected more than once. So taken together, these two provisions show a real concern with the amount of time that somebody stays in power, the possibility that that could lead to tyranny. And that makes a ton of sense if you think about the context, both for the Constitution and the 22nd Amendment. And if I could, I think here is maybe a time where history helps explain the enactment, the purpose of this text. The 22nd Amendment basically codifies what was a political norm, which was a political norm that dates back all the way to the founding of our nation. So we're talking about the 1700s. There was a political norm that nobody would serve more than 2 terms. So you have George Washington, who was asked by his supporters in 1796 to run for a third term. He declined. Around 1800, he was asked by his supporters to serve once again for a third term. He declined again. I think the concern there, that if you look back to those documents, the concern was that we had just wrested control away from a monarchy, and one person holding power for too long just allowed for too much tyranny. It allowed for the accumulation of power. It didn't provide a check, and it, in some sense, put us too close to a political system we had just pulled away from. That norm held all the way until 1940, when an incredibly popular President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when World War II broke out, decided to run for a third term. Again, very popular. He won a third term, and he even won a fourth term, but wasn't able to serve that fourth term because he died. So at that point, people were concerned that what had been a norm of not serving more than 2 times had been broken at this point. And even though he was widely popular, people across the ideological divide, including his supporters, were concerned enough about the accumulation of power that they proposed the 22nd Amendment. And of course, then the 22nd Amendment was passed by Congress by a supermajority and ratified by the states. So the concern was the norm had been broken, and so we had to actually codify that into the Constitution. And that's how we got the 22nd Amendment.
So let's look at the wording of the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. It's pretty clear. It states, no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. No person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. Praveen, does it leave any room for interpretation?
No, it doesn't, and that's why, for the most part, this conversation has not been a serious one until very recently.
Democrats tendered a warning that President Trump would govern as an authoritarian figure if he returned to the White House, and that's being borne out in many of the things he's doing. Let's look at some of the proposals being bandied about that people suggest would allow Trump to bypass the term limits in the Constitution, no matter how far-fetched they might be. Referring to that NBC interview I mentioned, one of the options was having J.D. Vance lead the GOP ticket in 2028 with Trump as his running mate. Vance would then, they say, resign once he's sworn into office, allowing Donald Trump to resume his presidency for a third time. So Derek Muller, who's an election law professor at the University of Notre Dame, said the Constitution's 12th Amendment indicates no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. That's a weird trick that wouldn't work, would it?
No, exactly as you said. You can't read the 22nd Amendment in isolation. You have to read the rest of the Constitution. And when you consider the 12th Amendment, that wouldn't work. Also, I'll call attention to your word trick, and that's exactly what I think is being proposed. I've heard conversations about there might be a way to bypass the Constitution, or there might be a workaround. I think we have to look very seriously at language like that and ask ourselves, why is it that proponents of this notion are seeking to bypass or work around the Constitution? Why are they approaching our nation's highest law as something that they need to work around? Our nation's founding charter is something that we should honor, not circumvent.
All right, so all sorts of things are being bandied about here. Is there any way that Donald Trump could serve as vice president?
No, exactly as you said, the 12th Amendment makes it very clear that if you're not eligible to serve as president, then you cannot serve as vice president.
All right. Now, some Trump allies suggest that he could run for a third term because his two terms were not consecutive. In fact, Steve Bannon frequently argues the Constitution allows him to run again because his terms were not consecutive.
There's nothing in the Constitution's term limits. There's nothing in the 22nd Amendment, the 12th Amendment, or anywhere else in the Constitution that injects this consecutive notion. And in fact, frankly, there have been efforts to amend the Constitution to sort of address this consecutive point. So certainly, if proponents of this idea want to amend the Constitution to repeal the 22nd Amendment, then there's a legal pathway to do that. But to simply look at the Constitution as it's written right now, as it exists right now, and to try to inject this kind of nuance is injecting a gray area that simply doesn't exist in the text and history of the Constitution as we have it right now.
You know, I find it interesting that we're even having this conversation, but I know that Donald Trump looks to people like Vladimir Putin and others as an example. So let's go to Pam Bondi, the president's attorney general. She told senators in her confirmation hearing that Donald Trump could not serve a third term unless they changed the Constitution. That said, and bear with me here, back to Steve Bannon, a former White House strategist to Trump during his first term. He said last month that he, conservative attorney Mike Davis, and others are devising strategies for Trump to stay in office, warning that Democrats will try to imprison the president if he relinquishes power. Quote, "We're working on it," Bannon said. "I think we'll have a couple of alternatives." He told News Nation. "We'll see what the definition of term limit is. Is there room to interpret the definition of term limits?"
No, there isn't. The Constitution very clearly says that the president has a four-year term. It's Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1, that says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years. That's the definition, of a term according to the Constitution. So I don't understand. I don't understand this injected gray area because, frankly, it's clear.
So how can all of this even be bandied about at this point?
I think, obviously I don't want to impute a motive, but I think we have seen this before, which is to say, sometimes fringe ideas are thrown out to see whether they gain traction and to give them time to sort of circulate in conservative or right-wing echo chambers, and with the hope that something that is fringe, out of the mainstream, and really doesn't have any legal support across the ideological spectrum will gain attraction. And what I think is concerning is to see these ideas that don't have support within the mainstream legal establishment across the ideological divide being thrown out with the hopes that they can be normalized. These fringe ideas will be normalized if repeated enough.
What would happen if he tried to solicit money for a third term? Lawsuits fly?
I think lawsuits will fly. I think lawsuits will fly. I think, there's the potential for other potential candidates who will challenge his ability, to serve or raise money if he can't constitutionally serve. But I think, we often think about the Constitution and constitutional law as the province of courts and litigation. And certainly the courts are an important place in which constitutional meaning is hammered out. But I think, it's also important for us to remember that, the Constitution has lots of actors who serve and can serve as agents of accountability. And that's not just the courts, that's the American public. The Constitution, after all, in its preamble begins, "We the people." And so the American public can also serve as powerful agents of constitutional accountability. People, when they see fundraising appeals or when they hear this talk about a third term, they can shut that down. They cannot humor this conversation. They can refuse to play along with fundraising appeals or this sort of rhetoric. Political parties can also say, look, we don't actually want to have this serious conversation because it siphons off attention and resources from individuals who could constitutionally and legally serve. So there are lots of folks who can serve as agents of constitutional accountability even before we get to the point of lawsuits, which, as you say, I think will actually, definitely be filed, if this goes to a more serious place.
Let me toss something else out here, and it's not something that, when you and I were going back and forth via email about the topics that we would address here, but there is another Trump that could enter the foray here and carry out the Trump agenda, and it probably would be constitutional if Donald Trump Jr. were to be on the ticket. The Trump agenda could very well be carried out, right? And that would all be legal.
For sure. I mean, assuming that, that Donald Trump Jr. Meets all the constitutional requirements, that's, age, natural born citizen, all of those individuals, you're absolutely right. An individual, whether it's Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, any other individual who is aligned with the president's, agenda could certainly carry out the president's agenda. It is also true that J.D. Vance could, run for president, and J.D. Vance, who was vetted by Donald Trump to be his vice president, could carry out his agenda. There are ways, of course, that other individuals who are constitutionally able to serve as president could carry out the agenda. And you're right, whether that's politically palatable to me or other people, it's certainly constitutional.
Right. It's the same way that Michelle Obama could run for the Democratic Party, though her husband Barack Obama couldn't run.
That's exactly right.
All right. So we have to ask, what is really going on with Donald Trump and this talk of a third term? What is he doing by declaring this intention to run again? And the wordplay, does Donald Trump really care about meeting the requirements? Does he care about the constitutional limits of his authority? He's already made it clear in several instances that the law really doesn't apply to him. That and more when Politics and Power continues. Welcome back to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton with Praveen Fernandes, Vice President at the Constitutional Accountability Center in Washington and a constitutional law expert. So, Praveen, President Trump continues to challenge constitutional provisions on a number of fronts, and he wants to expand executive power. Changing presidential term limits would require a constitutional amendment and need support from, I believe it's 3/4 of the states. That's unlikely, and it would be time-consuming. But there are some who suggest there might be an end around to the Constitution. One involves what's practically a word game. It gets around a key word in the 22nd Amendment's restriction, the word elected. So Brian Colt, a law professor at Michigan State University, wrote about a hypothetical two-term president getting nominated to run for vice president in Constitutional Cliffhangers, a legal guide for presidents and their enemies. A potential loophole there?
No, I think you're right that there is the word elected, but I think when you look at the other parts of the 22nd Amendment, you see at least the concern was not just about being elected, but really about time served. So there's that second part of the provision that I mentioned that says that you can only be elected once if you've served more than 2 years of somebody else's term. Taken together, if you look at the purpose of the amendment, it's clear that the concern of the framers of the 22nd Amendment was the time spent in power. So once an individual has actually served 2 terms, that concern has been triggered. And so there is no end run around that, as well as the fact that, as you mentioned, there's the 12th Amendment that says if somebody is not eligible to serve as president, then they can't serve as vice president.
And any constitutional amendment would take quite a bit of time, and 2028's 3 years away. Probably need more time than that.
For sure. As you mentioned, a constitutional amendment has to be passed by supermajorities. That's 2/3 of the House and Senate, and then go to the states to be ratified by 3/4. There's another way around as well. Every amendment that we've had has gone through that mechanism. There's also a way in which 3/4 of the states can call for a constitutional convention, and that constitutional convention can come up with an amendment, and then that also has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. But both of these ways to amend the Constitution are incredibly time consuming, and that's by design. Our Constitution wasn't meant to be changed lightly. It is our nation's highest law, and it's meant to be relatively stable over time.
Let's talk about what I call the Donald Trump reality, and a more straightforward possibility that some constitutional scholars have not ruled out, which is Donald Trump running for a 3rd term as president, regardless of what the 22nd Amendment says. So I was reading an interview with Gloria Brown Marshall, who's a constitutional law professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. It was in an NPR interview. And she said, if you think about it, 22nd Amendment assumes that one would follow the Constitution. But if one is not going to follow the Constitution, what difference does it make what's written there? How do you think the Supreme Court would react in that instance?
I would hope that the Supreme Court obviously would serve as a check against unconstitutional behavior or unlawful behavior. And I think, we have seen signs that the Supreme Court is certainly aware of this moment of peril. I think we've seen sort of unconventional things happening recently that have troubled not only the American public, but also the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roberts recently issued a statement, which is incredibly rare. He issued a statement in reaction to calls both by Donald Trump, President Trump, and high-ranking members of his administration, who were calling for impeachment of district court judges who had served as checks against unlawful behavior by the administration. And a lot of these individuals were calling for impeachment of these district court judges. And the Chief Justice stepped in to issue a very rare public statement that reminded the American public and politicians that the remedy for a decision that you did not agree with at the lower court level is, of course, appealing that decision, not impeaching the judge or calling for the impeachment of a judge who had rendered that decision. And so I think what we see in that incredibly rare statement by the Chief Justice is a real sense that the Supreme Court's legacy is also on the line if they don't serve as a check against unlawful behavior by either of the other branches of government.
Well, look, the Supreme Court's been under a microscope lately, and you're right, it'd be a real test for John Roberts and protecting the integrity of the court, his court, which has been very much in question of late.
Yeah, you said it exactly right, his court. as you know, the sort of the custom is to identify a court by its chief justice. So you hear references to the Rehnquist Court, to the Warren Court. We have the Roberts Court because Chief Justice John Roberts is at the helm of that court. So the court at this moment is inextricably tied to Chief Justice John Roberts' name. I think a lot of commentators, not just ones recently, have described Chief Justice John Roberts as an institutionalist, one who's very concerned about the institution of the courts, the institution of the Supreme Court, and specifically the Roberts Court that bears his name. And I think that is something that I would hope, and I think he's keenly aware of at this moment.
And looking at history, and you probably, in fact, I'm certain you know this better than I, seems the High Court has ways of ducking certain issues, like the 22nd Amendment question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I describe it as ducking the issues so much as I would say that the Supreme Court hasn't, adjudicated with any level of finality any 22nd Amendment case. But that's partially because, as I said, nobody has thought to seriously put this forward. People have complied with the text and history of the Constitution. People have taken the 22nd Amendment seriously, but they've also taken term limits seriously. And so the Supreme Court hasn't really been faced with this before. So it just hasn't been before the court in any way that allowed them to adjudicate the substance of it.
So we don't have a crystal ball. To the question I posed before the break, given his actions of late, does Donald Trump really care about meeting the requirements? Does he care about the constitutional limits of his authority?
I don't want to step outside of my lane. I'm certainly not an expert on what Donald Trump is thinking or what he cares about, and I think that's probably something that's better addressed by political commentators. What I can say is that we have seen observable behavior by both Donald Trump as president, Donald Trump as candidate when he was running for office, and his administration of trying to circulate ideas that are plainly outside of the mainstream and hoping that they will be normalized. And so I think at that point, whether or not either Donald Trump, his supporters, or his administration cares about the text and history of the Constitution, that's where other institutions need to serve as a check against those impulses. The Constitution was designed to provide checks and balances. There are 3 branches, and each branch is meant to serve its purpose. And it's in moments like these that those other 2 branches need to serve their constitutional role. If somebody, hypothetically Donald Trump or somebody else, proposes doing something that is unconstitutional, there are a set of exquisite checks and balances that were established by the Constitution, but those depend on those other branches playing their role and serving as a check against unlawful authority.
Sometimes it's kind of difficult to figure out what Donald Trump really means, what he says, what he does. It's difficult to figure out. More than 3 years until the 2028 election, which I already mentioned. Here's what Trump has to say about running again, and he's playing coy here.
No, people are asking me to run, and there's a whole story about running for a 3rd term. I don't know. I never looked into it. They do say there's a way you can do it, but I don't know about that, but I have not looked into it. I want to do a fantastic job. We have 4 years, just about, almost close to 4 years. Time is flying, but it's still close to 4 years.
So he's 11 weeks in now. He was more definitive in that NBC interview with Kristen Welker and said he wasn't joking, as we mentioned before. So, Praveen, barring an amendment, would a test of the Constitution's presidential term limits further destabilize the U.S. political landscape at a time when the ability of the courts and certainly Congress to serve as checks and balances of the White House is under question?
I think it could be destabilizing unless the American public and other institutions, serve as checks against, unconstitutional and unlawful impulses. So I think that whether this destabilizing thing goes forward, is a test for the courts. It's a test for other branches of government, but it's also a test of the American public that can also serve as an important agent of constitutional accountability.
And maybe Donald Trump is just saying, look, I'm not going anywhere, and I want to make sure that what I'm proposing now legislatively, what I'm trying to do with the tariffs, and what I'm trying to do economically for this country, bring back manufacturing, I want to make sure it sticks. So maybe that's his agenda. We don't know.
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. I will say that the popularity part is sort of a non sequitur. I think our constitutional requirements are pretty clear. If someone is extremely popular as a 29-year-old or 30-year-old, and the American public wants to vote that person in as president, it doesn't circumvent the fact that the Constitution also has age limits and age requirements that one has to meet. The Constitution doesn't have a popularity footnote that allows people to get around the text, history, and plain meaning of the Constitution simply because people are popular or because their supporters want them to run again.
The point is that, according to the Constitution, there are things that are non-negotiable.
That's exactly right.
Praveen, thank you very much for putting things in context, perspective, and focus. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I appreciate those of you who tuned in to watch Politics and Power. You can watch on demand anytime on the News4JAX YouTube channel and News4JAX.com. As always, I appreciate the things that you bring to the table and the comments that you have, that you bring forward. And if you care to write, you know where to find me. Have a great day.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.